Margaret Hayes stood in the recruitment office, her hands trembling slightly as she filled out the paperwork. At 42 years old, with silver streaks threading through her dark hair, she looked nothing like the typical military recruit. Around her, fresh-faced 18- and 19-year-olds chatted nervously about basic training, their voices high with excitement and fear. She had been teaching high school mathematics for 20 years when her world fell apart. Her husband David, a construction worker, had died in an accident on the job site. The insurance money wouldn't last forever, and her teacher's salary barely covered the mortgage on their small house in Ohio. Her 2 children, Sarah and Michael, were both in college, and she refused to burden them with her financial struggles. The decision to join the military hadn't come easily. Margaret had always been patriotic, always respected those who served, but she never imagined herself in uniform. The recruitment ads she'd seen on television showed young, fit people running through obstacle courses and climbing ropes. She was a middle-aged widow who got winded climbing the stairs to her second-floor classroom. But desperation makes people brave in ways they never expected. "Ma'am, are you sure about this?" asked Sergeant Rodriguez, the recruiter, as he reviewed her application. His voice wasn't unkind, but she could hear the doubt. "Basic training is intense. Most people your age, well, they don't usually—" Margaret straightened her shoulders. "I'm sure, Sergeant." He looked at her teaching credentials, her college degree, her clean record. "With your background, you'd be perfect for an administrative position, behind a desk, using your education. That might be more suitable for someone in your situation." The words stung, but Margaret kept her voice steady. "I want to be a regular soldier, Sergeant. I want the full experience." The truth was more complicated than she let on. Yes, she needed the steady pay and benefits the military offered, but there was something else driving her, something she couldn't quite name. Since David's death, she had felt invisible, forgotten. Her students saw her as just another teacher counting down to retirement. Her neighbors whispered about the poor widow who couldn't take care of her own yard anymore. She wanted to prove that her life wasn't over, that at 42, she still had fight left in her. The night before shipping out to Fort Moore in Georgia, Margaret sat in her empty house, surrounded by boxes of her belongings. Sarah had called from college, crying, begging her mother to reconsider. Michael had been supportive but worried. Her sister Janet thought she'd lost her mind completely. "You're throwing away a good job for some midlife crisis," Janet had said during their last phone conversation. "You're not 19 anymore, Maggie. This is crazy." Maybe it was crazy. Margaret ran her fingers over David's photo on the mantel. He'd always told her she was stronger than she knew. "I guess we're about to find out," she whispered to his picture. The bus ride to Fort Moore was the longest 8 hours of her life. She sat next to a girl named Amy who couldn't stop talking about how excited she was to get away from home and do something important. The girl was the same age as Sarah, with bright eyes and boundless energy. "What made you decide to join?" Amy asked, popping gum between her words. "I needed a change," Margaret replied simply. "That's cool. My recruiter said I'd be perfect for the military because I played sports in high school. Are you athletic?" Margaret almost laughed. "Not exactly." When they arrived at Fort Moore, the drill sergeants were waiting. Margaret had expected yelling. She'd seen enough military movies, but the reality was more intimidating than she'd imagined. These men and women commanded respect through pure presence. "Welcome to your new home," bellowed Drill Sergeant Williams, a woman who looked like she could bench press a car. "For the next 14 weeks, you belong to me. You eat when I say eat, you sleep when I say sleep, and you breathe when I say breathe." Margaret stood in formation with 47 other recruits. She was easily the oldest person there. Some of the younger soldiers kept glancing at her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to pity. She could practically hear their thoughts. What is this old lady doing here? The first few days were a blur of paperwork, medical exams, and uniform fittings. Margaret struggled to remember everyone's names and tried to keep up with the constant schedule changes. Her bunk was next to Amy's, who had appointed herself Margaret's unofficial guide to military life. "Don't worry, Mrs. Hayes," Amy whispered one night after lights out. "I'll help you with everything. My mom is about your age, so I know how hard this must be." Margaret appreciated the kindness, but the comment made her feel ancient. Mrs. Hayes. She'd been Margaret to her students, Maggie to her friends, Honey to David, Now she was just an old woman trying to play soldier. The real challenges began with the first physical training session. At 0500 hours, the drill sergeants roused them for a morning run. Margaret had prepared for this as much as she could, jogging around her neighborhood for months before enlisting. But running on suburban sidewalks was nothing compared to this. "Move it, move it, move it!" Sergeant Williams shouted as they ran through the Georgia humidity. Margaret's lungs burned and her legs felt like concrete, but she kept moving. She watched younger recruits sprinting ahead of her, their movements fluid and effortless. By the time she crossed the finish line, she was dead last. Several recruits had already caught their breath and were stretching. Margaret bent over, hands on her knees, trying not to vomit. "Hayes!" Sergeant Williams appeared beside her. "You okay?" "Yes, ma'am," Margaret gasped. "Good, because this was just the warm-up." At night, Margaret called her sister from one of the payphones in the barracks hallway. "Janet, I think I made a mistake. Come home, Maggie. Nobody would blame you." "You tried." But something stopped her from agreeing. Maybe it was stubborn pride, or maybe it was the memory of David telling her she was stronger than she knew. Either way, she wasn't ready to quit. The next morning brought new challenges. Hand-to-hand combat training left her bruised and sore. Weapons familiarization made her nervous. She'd never held a gun in her life. The classroom sessions on military protocol and history were easier, but even there, she struggled to adjust to the different learning environment. "The thing about basic training," explained Private Johnson, a 20-year-old from Texas who'd become something of a spokesperson for their platoon, "is that it's designed to break you down first, then build you back up. The Army way." Margaret understood the concept intellectually, but living it was different. Every morning she woke up questioning her decision. Every night she fell into her bunk exhausted and discouraged. The breaking point came during the second week, during what Sergeant Williams called team-building exercises. The platoon was supposed to work together to navigate a series of challenges, carrying heavy equipment across rough terrain, scaling walls, crossing obstacles. Margaret tried her best, but she was clearly the weak link. When her team struggled to lift a simulated wounded soldier, it was because she couldn't bear her share of the weight. When they had to climb a 12-foot wall, she needed help from 3 other people to make it over. "This is ridiculous," muttered Private Coleman, a muscular young man from California. "We're only as strong as our weakest link." He didn't say it directly to Margaret, but he didn't need to. Everyone knew who he meant. That evening, Margaret sat alone in the mess hall, pushing food around her plate without eating. Amy approached with her tray. "Mind if I sit?" Margaret shrugged. "Sure. Don't let Coleman get to you. He's a jerk." "He's not wrong, though. I am slowing everyone down." Amy studied her for a moment. "Can I ask you something? Why are you really here? And don't say you needed a change. There are easier ways to change careers." Margaret was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke. "My husband died 2 years ago. Since then, everyone treats me like I'm already dead, too. Like I'm just waiting around to die. I wanted to prove that I'm still alive." "Are you? What, still alive?" Margaret looked around the mess hall at all the young faces, full of hope and determination. She thought about her students back home, probably wondering why their math teacher had disappeared. She thought about David, who'd always believed in her even when she didn't believe in herself. "I'm starting to remember," she said quietly. The conversation was interrupted by an announcement over the intercom. "All recruits report to the training field at 19 hours for evening PT." Margaret groaned. More running, more exercises she'd fail at. More proof that she didn't belong here. But as she walked to the training field with Amy chattering beside her, something shifted in her mindset. She'd spent 2 weeks focusing on everything she couldn't do, every way she was falling short. Maybe it was time to focus on what she could do. She was still here. Despite the pain, despite the embarrassment, despite everyone's doubts, including her own, she was still here. That had to count for something. The evening PT session was brutal. Sprints, push-ups, sit-ups, more sprints. Margaret finished last in every exercise, but she finished. As the platoon was dismissed, Sergeant Williams called her aside. "Hayes, a word." Margaret's heart sank. This was it. They were going to send her home. "Ma'am? I've been watching you struggle these past 2 weeks. Yes, ma'am. I know I'm not performing at the level expected." "That's true. You're not." Sergeant Williams studied her with sharp eyes. "But you know what else I've noticed? You haven't quit. Some of these kids, they fail one exercise and they're crying to go home. You fail 10 exercises and you show up for the 11th one." Margaret didn't know what to say. "I'm not going to lie to you, Hayes. This isn't going to get easier. If anything, it's going to get harder. The obstacle course is coming up in 6 weeks, and it's where most people who are going to fail basic training actually fail. You need to decide if you're here to prove a point or if you're here to become a soldier. What's the difference, ma'am? A soldier doesn't quit when things get hard. A soldier finds a way to get the job done, even when everyone says it's impossible." Sergeant Williams paused. "Especially when everyone says it's impossible." That night, Margaret lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling. Around her, 46 other recruits were sleeping, probably dreaming about graduation day and their future assignments. She thought about the obstacle course Sergeant Williams had mentioned. She'd seen pictures of it during the orientation tour. Walls to climb, ropes to swing on, barriers to crawl under. It looked impossible for someone like her. But impossible was relative, wasn't it? 2 weeks ago, she would have said it was impossible for a 42-year-old widow from Ohio to survive even one day of basic training. Yet here she was. Margaret Hayes closed her eyes and, for the first time since arriving at Fort Moore, she didn't think about quitting. Instead, she started planning how she was going to succeed. The 3rd week of basic training brought a shift in Margaret's approach that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of dreading the 0500 wake-up call, she started getting up at 0430, giving herself extra time to prepare mentally for the day's challenges. While her fellow recruits groaned and complained about the early hour, Margaret was already dressed and ready. "You're making us all look bad," joked Private Martinez, a stocky young man from New Mexico who'd become one of the more supportive voices in their platoon. Nobody should be that alert before coffee. Margaret smiled as she tied her boots with military precision. "I figured out I need more time than you kids to get my old bones moving." The comment was meant as a joke, but it revealed something important about Margaret's new strategy. Instead of fighting against her age and physical limitations, she was learning to work with them. When the younger recruits could rely on natural athleticism and quick recovery, Margaret had to be smarter, more methodical, more prepared. This new mindset showed itself first during weapons training. While other recruits struggled to remember the detailed procedures for cleaning and maintaining their rifles, Margaret approached it like teaching a math lesson, breaking down complex processes into manageable steps, creating mental frameworks for remembering information. "Outstanding work, Hayes," said Sergeant First Class Thompson, the weapons instructor, as he inspected her rifle. "This is exactly how it should be done." Margaret felt a flush of pride. It was the first time since arriving at Fort Moore that she'd received praise for her performance rather than encouragement for her effort. Amy, who'd been struggling with weapons maintenance, approached Margaret after the session. "Could you help me with this? I keep messing up the order of operations." "Of course," Margaret replied, then paused. "But why are you asking me? Johnson and Coleman are much better at the physical stuff." "Yeah, but you're the only one who actually explains things in a way that makes sense. You're a teacher, right?" "It shows." Word spread quickly through the platoon that Hayes was good at explaining things. Soon, Margaret found herself leading impromptu study sessions for everything from military history to first aid procedures. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd joined the military to get away from teaching, only to discover that her teaching skills were her greatest asset. The change in her role within the platoon was gradual but noticeable. Instead of being the weak link everyone had to help, she became the person others came to when they needed help understanding something. It didn't make her faster or stronger, but it made her valuable in a different way. "You know what's funny?" Amy said one evening as they cleaned their gear. "When you first got here, everyone thought you'd be the first to quit. Now you're like the mom of the platoon." Margaret winced. "Please don't call me the platoon mom. I'm trying to be a soldier, not a den mother." "You're both," Amy insisted. "That's what makes you different." The physical training remained Margaret's biggest challenge, but even there she began to see improvement. Not in her speed or strength. She was still the slowest runner and struggled with the heavier equipment, but in her endurance and determination. She developed a reputation for never giving up, no matter how difficult the exercise. During a particularly brutal session that involved carrying 70-pound packs over rough terrain, Margaret found herself falling behind as usual. But this time, instead of apologizing or making excuses, she simply kept moving forward at her own pace. When she finally reached the finish line, long after the others had completed the exercise, Drill Sergeant Williams was waiting for her. "How do you feel, Hayes?" "Tired, ma'am, but good." "Why good?" Margaret considered the question. "Because I finished. 6 weeks ago, I couldn't have carried this pack 50 feet. Now, I just carried it 3 miles. "That's right. You did." Williams nodded approvingly. "Progress isn't always about being the fastest or the strongest. Sometimes it's about being better than you were yesterday." The conversation marked a turning point in Margaret's relationship with her drill sergeant. Williams began paying more attention to Margaret's individual progress rather than comparing her to the younger recruits. She started offering specific advice for how Margaret could work around her physical limitations and play to her strengths. "You'll never be the fastest runner in this platoon," Williams told her during a private conversation after evening chow. "But you might be the smartest. And in the real army, smart counts for a lot more than people think." As the weeks passed, Margaret's confidence grew. She volunteered for leadership positions during team exercises, using her natural teaching abilities to help organize and motivate her squad. Her classroom performance was consistently excellent, and she often scored highest on written exams. But the obstacle course loomed ahead like a mountain she'd have to climb. Everyone knew about the obstacle course. It was the ultimate test of physical fitness during basic training, a series of walls, ropes, barriers, and challenges that had to be completed within a strict time limit. Failing the obstacle course meant failing basic training, regardless of how well you performed in other areas. Margaret had seen the course during their orientation tour on the first day. It looked impossible then, and it still looked impossible now. Despite all of her progress, there were walls that seemed designed for people much taller than her 5'4" frame, ropes that required upper body strength she simply didn't possess, and obstacles that demanded the kind of agility and speed that belonged to people half her age. The official attempt was still 3 weeks away, but practice sessions had already begun. These weren't scored runs. They were chances for recruits to familiarize themselves with each obstacle and work on their weaknesses. Margaret's first practice run was a disaster. She couldn't get over the 8-foot wall without assistance from other recruits. She fell off the rope climb twice, and she got stuck crawling under the low barriers and had to be pulled through by her ankles. By the time she completed the course, she was covered in mud, bleeding from several scrapes, and completely demoralized. 23 minutes, called out Sergeant Williams, checking her stopwatch. The passing time is 15 minutes. 8 minutes might not sound like much, but on an obstacle course, it was an eternity. Margaret sat on the ground, fighting back tears of frustration. Coleman, who had finished the course in just under 11 minutes, walked past her, shaking his head. "There's no way she's going to pass," he said to Johnson, not bothering to lower his voice. "They should just send her home now and save everyone the embarrassment." Amy overheard and confronted him. "Shut up, Coleman. At least she's trying." "Trying isn't enough," Coleman shot back. "This isn't participation trophy time. Either you can do the job or you can't." Margaret wanted to argue, but she couldn't. Coleman was right. In 3 weeks, when it counted, either she would be able to complete the obstacle course in under 15 minutes, or she would fail basic training. All the progress she'd made in other areas wouldn't matter. That night, she called her sister from the payphone again. "How's it going, Maggie?" Janet asked, her voice full of concern. "I don't know if I can do this, Jan. The training is too hard. There's this test coming up, a physical test. If I fail it, I'm out." Margaret could hear the relief in her sister's voice. Maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing. You've proven your point. Nobody could say you didn't try. But Margaret realized she didn't want to just try anymore. She wanted to succeed. After hanging up the phone, she found herself walking to the training area where the obstacle course sat silent in the darkness. She wasn't allowed to practice on her own. Safety regulations required supervision, but she could at least study it, figure out what she was up against. Each obstacle seemed designed to exploit her weaknesses. The wall required height and upper body strength she didn't have. The rope climb needed the same kind of strength plus coordination. The crawling sections favored smaller, more flexible bodies, which should have been an advantage for her. but her lack of speed turned it into another liability. Can't sleep? Margaret turned to find Sergeant Williams approaching, her footsteps nearly silent on the grass. I was just looking, ma'am, trying to figure out how to beat this thing. Williams joined her in studying the course. What do you see? A bunch of obstacles I can't get over, under, or through fast enough. That's one way to look at it. What's another way? Margaret considered the question. I don't know, ma'am. I've been doing this for 12 years, Hayes. I've seen thousands of recruits attempt this course. You want to know what I've learned? Yes, ma'am. The people who think it's impossible usually prove themselves right. The people who think it's just a puzzle to solve sometimes surprise everyone. Williams pointed to the 8-foot wall. What makes that wall hard for you? I'm too short to reach the top, and I don't have enough upper body strength to pull myself over. Right. So if you can't go over it the same way everyone else does, how else might you get over it? Margaret studied the wall more carefully. I could use momentum, get a running start, plant my foot higher up, use my leg strength instead of trying to muscle through with my arms. That's thinking like a soldier. Speed and power aren't the only tools in the toolbox. Sometimes technique and intelligence work better. They moved to the rope climb, and Williams asked the same question. Margaret began to see that each obstacle wasn't just a physical challenge. It was a problem that could be solved in different ways. Ma'am, can I ask you something? Shoot. Do you think I can actually pass this course? Williams was quiet for a long moment. I think you have a better chance than you realize, but it's not going to happen by accident. You're going to have to work smarter and harder than everyone else. How? Come see me after chow tomorrow. We're going to design a training program specifically for you. The next evening, Margaret found herself back at the obstacle course with Sergeant Williams and a detailed training plan. Williams had broken down each obstacle into its component skills and identified specific exercises Margaret could do to improve her performance. The wall is about explosive leg power and technique, not upper body strength, Williams explained. We're going to work on your jumping ability and practice the most efficient way to get over it. For the rope climb, the focus would be on technique and grip strength, rather than trying to muscle her way up. The crawling sections could be improved with flexibility training and practice finding the most efficient body position. This is going to be in addition to your regular training, Williams warned. You'll be putting in extra time every day for the next 3 weeks. Margaret nodded. I understand, ma'am. I hope you do. Because if you're serious about this, you're about to discover what you're really made of. The training began immediately. Every day after the regular PT sessions, Margaret returned to the obstacle course for additional practice. Williams worked with her on technique, breaking down each movement into teachable components, much like Margaret had done when explaining complex mathematical concepts to her students. The progress was slow at first. Margaret's initial practice time of 23 minutes dropped to 21 minutes, then 20. But she was still 5 minutes away from passing, and each minute saved became harder than the last. The other recruits began to notice her extra training sessions. Some were supportive. Amy often stayed to cheer her on, and Martinez offered encouragement. Others remained skeptical. She's wasting everyone's time, Coleman said during one evening meal. Williams is spending all this extra time with her when she could be helping people who actually have a chance. Maybe you should focus on your own performance, Amy shot back. Last time I checked, nobody asked for your opinion. The tension in the platoon was becoming noticeable. Some recruits admired Margaret's determination and saw her as an inspiration. Others viewed her as a liability who was taking resources away from the group. Margaret tried to ignore the politics and focus on her training, but the pressure was mounting. 2 weeks before the official obstacle course test, Margaret achieved a personal breakthrough. During a practice run, everything seemed to click. Her technique on the wall was smoother, her rope climb was more efficient, and she moved through the crawling sections with newfound speed. When Williams clicked her stopwatch at the end, Margaret held her breath. 16 minutes, 45 seconds. It wasn't good enough yet, but it was the first time she'd broken 17 minutes. Margaret felt a surge of hope mixed with determination. We're getting close, Williams said with a slight smile. Real close. But close wasn't good enough. She still needed to find almost 2 more minutes of improvement in just 2 weeks. As Margaret walked back to the barracks that evening, she realized she was about to enter the most challenging phase of her entire military experience. The final push toward the obstacle course test would determine whether her unlikely journey from Ohio math teacher to soldier would end in success or heartbreak. The 2 weeks leading up to the obstacle course test transformed Margaret Hayes into someone she didn't recognize. Every muscle in her body ached constantly. Her hands were covered in calluses from rope climbing, and she fell asleep each night completely exhausted. But for the first time since arriving at Fort Moore, she felt truly alive. Her training schedule became relentless. Up at 0415 for personal preparation, regular PT from 0500 to 0630, classes and training throughout the day, then back to the obstacle course from 1730 to 1900 for specialized training with Sergeant Williams. After evening chow, she spent another hour working on flexibility and strength exercises in the barracks. "You're becoming obsessed," Amy warned her one evening as Margaret practiced grip strength exercises with a rubber ball. "You need to rest sometimes, too." "I can rest after I pass the course," Margaret replied, not looking up from her exercises. Amy studied her friend with concern. "What if you don't pass? What then?" The question stopped Margaret cold. She'd been so focused on the training that she hadn't allowed herself to seriously consider the possibility of failure. But failure was real. Despite all her improvement, she was still cutting it close. "Then I go home," Margaret said quietly. "And everyone who said I was too old and too weak was right. That's not true. You've already proven them wrong just by getting this far."
Margaret shook her head.
"Getting this far doesn't matter if I can't finish. In the Army, mission completion is what counts. Either you can do the job or you can't." She was echoing Coleman's words from weeks earlier, but now she understood their truth. This wasn't about effort or participation. It was about capability under pressure. The specialized training with Sergeant Williams intensified as the test date approached. Williams had broken down Margaret's technique on each obstacle into minute details, constantly refining and adjusting her approach. "Your wall technique is solid now," Williams observed during a practice session. "Your rope climb has improved dramatically. The crawling sections are actually becoming a strength, but you're losing time on the transitions between obstacles." Margaret had been so focused on conquering each individual challenge that she hadn't paid attention to the time lost jogging between them. Williams timed her transitions and discovered she was losing nearly 30 seconds simply moving from one obstacle to the next. 30 seconds doesn't sound like much, Williams explained, but it's the difference between passing and failing for you. They worked on maintaining momentum between obstacles, mapping the most efficient route through the course, and teaching Margaret to recover quickly from each challenge, instead of taking time to catch her breath. The physical improvements were accompanied by mental changes that surprised Margaret. The doubt and fear that had characterized her early weeks at Fort Moore were being replaced by a quiet confidence, not the cocky assurance of the younger recruits, but the steady determination of someone who had faced her limitations and found ways to work around them. This mental transformation didn't go unnoticed by the other recruits. Johnson, who had initially been skeptical of Margaret's chances, began asking her for advice on other aspects of training. "How do you stay so calm during the hard stuff?" he asked after a particularly challenging field exercise. "When things get crazy, you just keep thinking clearly." Margaret considered the question. "I think it's because I've already failed at so many things here that I'm not afraid of failing anymore. When you're not afraid to fail, you can focus on what you need to do to succeed." It was a lesson she'd learned the hard way through 2 months of constant struggle. The week before the obstacle course test brought an unexpected challenge. During a routine medical inspection, the base doctor noticed that Margaret's blood pressure was elevated. The stress of intensive training, combined with the pressure of the approaching test, was taking a physical toll. "I'm going to recommend you take a few days of rest," Dr. Peterson told her after checking her vitals a second time. "I can't do that, sir. My test is in 6 days. Mrs. Hayes, pushing yourself beyond your body's limits isn't going to help you pass. If anything, it might hurt your performance." The recommendation felt like a death sentence. Margaret had been making steady progress, and the momentum felt crucial to her success. But Williams supported the doctor's advice. 1 day of forced rest, Williams told her. No training, no exercises, no thinking about the course. Doctor's orders. Margaret spent that day feeling lost and anxious. Without the structure of constant training, her mind was free to wander to all the ways she might fail. She tried reading, tried writing letters home, tried anything to distract herself from the approaching test. That evening, as she sat alone in the common area, Private Martinez approached her. "Mind if I join you?" Margaret shrugged. "Sure." Martinez sat down heavily. "Can I tell you something? You've changed how I think about this whole experience." "How so?" "When I got here, I thought basic training was about being tough, being the strongest, the fastest, the most aggressive. I thought that's what made a good soldier." Margaret waited for him to continue. "But watching you these past 2 months, I realized I was wrong. Being a soldier isn't about being the toughest. It's about being the most determined. It's about refusing to quit when everything tells you to quit. I'm not sure I'm the best example of that. I've wanted to quit plenty of times, but you didn't. That's the point." Martinez leaned forward. "Do you know what the other recruits call you when you're not around?" Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "I'm not sure I want to know." "The machine." "What?" "The machine. Because no matter what they throw at you, no matter how hard it gets, you just keep going. Like a machine that never breaks down." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "I don't feel like a machine. I feel like I'm barely holding on most of the time. That's what makes it impressive. You're barely holding on, but you're still holding on." The conversation helped Margaret understand something important about her journey. She'd been so focused on her physical limitations and technical improvements that she'd missed the bigger transformation happening. She was becoming the kind of person who didn't quit, even when quitting would be easier and more comfortable. The forced rest day actually helped. When Margaret returned to training the next morning, she felt refreshed and focused. Her practice run that day was her best yet, 15 minutes and 38 seconds. Still not quite fast enough, but close enough to taste success. "You found another 20 seconds in the past week," Williams observed. "The question is whether you can find 38 more when it counts." The final practice session was scheduled for the day before the official test. Margaret approached it with a mixture of confidence and nervousness. She'd done everything possible to prepare. Her technique was as good as it could be, her fitness level was the best it had been in 20 years, and her knowledge of the course was encyclopedic. She lined up at the starting line with her practice group, took a deep breath, and waited for Williams' signal. "Go!" Margaret exploded off the starting line with more speed than she'd ever managed before. Her first obstacle was the low crawl under barbed wire. She dropped to her belly and moved through the mud with fluid efficiency, keeping her head low and her body streamlined. Up and over the 5-foot barrier. Her technique here had improved dramatically. Instead of struggling to pull herself over, she used her momentum and leg strength to vault across smoothly. The 8-foot wall loomed ahead. This had been her nemesis for months, but now she approached it with confidence. Running start, plant the left foot high on the wall, explosive jump, grab the top edge, swing the right leg over. She was over the wall and moving to the next obstacle before she had time to think about what she'd just accomplished. Rope climb, hand over hand, using her legs to support her weight, moving with rhythm instead of desperation. Up to the top, ring the bell, controlled descent. Through the tire course, over the balance beam, under another low crawl section. Each obstacle flowed into the next with practiced efficiency. The final challenge was the rope swing over a mud pit. Margaret grabbed the rope, backed up to get momentum, and swung across. She landed cleanly on the other side and sprinted toward the finish line. When Williams clicked her stopwatch, Margaret was breathing hard but not gasping. She felt strong, controlled, and ready for more. "Time?" Williams looked at the stopwatch and smiled. 14 minutes, 57 seconds. Margaret stared at her in disbelief. "What?" "You heard me. 14:57. You just passed the obstacle course." The accomplishment felt surreal. After months of struggle, doubt, and incremental progress, she had actually done it. But this was just practice. Tomorrow was the official test, the one that counted. "Don't get overconfident," Williams warned, reading her thoughts. "Practice and performance are different things. The pressure tomorrow is going to be intense. Everyone will be watching, including the company commander. Some people rise to that pressure, others crumble under it." Margaret nodded, but inside she felt something she hadn't experienced since arriving at Fort Moore. genuine optimism about her chances. That night, she called home from the payphone. Sarah answered on the second ring. "Mom, how are you?" "We've been so worried." "I'm good, sweetheart. Really good. I have my final test tomorrow." "The obstacle course thing you've been training for?" "Yes." And Sarah, "I think I'm going to pass." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mom, that's amazing. I'm so proud of you." "Are you? Really?" "Of course I am. When you first told us you were doing this, I thought you were crazy. I was scared you'd get hurt or embarrassed. But now I think you're the bravest person I know." After hanging up the phone, Margaret walked back to the barracks feeling lighter than she had in months. Amy was waiting for her with a small group of supportive recruits. "How are you feeling about tomorrow?" Amy asked. Margaret considered the question seriously. "Nervous. Excited. Ready?" "You're going to do great," said Martinez. "We all know it." Even some of the recruits who had been skeptical were offering encouragement now. Coleman wasn't among them, but Margaret no longer cared what he thought. His opinion couldn't change what she'd accomplished or what she was capable of achieving. She fell asleep that night easily, despite the magnitude of the next day's challenge. For the first time since arriving at basic training, Margaret Hayes felt ready for whatever the Army could throw at her. The obstacle course test was scheduled for 0800 hours. Margaret woke at 0430, giving herself extra time to prepare mentally and physically. She ate a light breakfast, went through her pre-training stretching routine, and spent a few minutes visualizing a successful run through the course. As she walked toward the testing area, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 months earlier, she had been a grieving widow wondering if her best years were behind her. Now she was a soldier, about to face the ultimate test of everything she'd learned and overcome. Whatever happened in the next 15 minutes would determine whether Margaret Hayes would graduate from basic training or go home in failure. But regardless of the outcome, she already knew the answer to the question that had driven her to enlist in the first place. She wasn't too old. She was exactly where she belonged. The testing area buzzed with nervous energy as 48 recruits prepared for their obstacle course evaluation. Margaret stood in formation with her platoon, watching as the company commander, Captain Rivera, reviewed the testing procedures with the drill sergeants. This wasn't just another training exercise. This was the moment that would determine who graduated and who went home. "Listen up!" Drill Sergeant Williams called out to the assembled recruits. "You'll be tested in groups of 6. When your name is called, report to the starting line. You have 1 attempt to complete the course in under 15 minutes. If you fail basic training. Questions. Margaret's group would go forth, which meant she had about an hour to watch other recruits attempt the course before her turn. Part of her wanted to go first and get it over with, but watching others might give her valuable last-minute insights. The first group included some of the strongest performers in the company. Johnson, who had been Margaret's early skeptic but had come to respect her determination, completed the course in just over 10 minutes, a solid pass with time to spare. Coleman, ever the athlete, finished in 9 minutes 37 seconds and made a show of flexing for his friends afterward. But the first group also included the first failure of the day. Private Walsh, a quiet young man from Montana, had struggled with the rope climb during training and failed to complete it within the time limit. Margaret watched as he was quietly pulled aside by Captain Rivera for a brief conversation that would likely end with his dismissal from the program. The sight sobered the waiting recruits. This was real. People were actually failing. The second and third groups had mixed results. Some recruits sailed through with time to spare, others squeaked by with seconds remaining, and 2 more failed to complete the course in time. The elimination rate was higher than Margaret had expected. Hayes, Martinez, Thompson, Kim, Foster, Williams. Sergeant Williams called out, "You're up!" Margaret's heart hammered as she approached the starting line. Amy, who was in the 5th group, called out encouragement, but Margaret barely heard her. All her focus was on the course ahead. She found herself lined up between Martinez, who had become one of her strongest supporters, and Private Thompson, a capable recruit from North Carolina who had always been friendly but focused on her own performance. "Remember," Sergeant Williams said, addressing their group, "this is the same course you've been practicing on for weeks. Nothing has changed except the stakes. Use what you've learned and trust your training." Captain Rivera checked his watch and raised his hand. "Recruits ready?" "Yes, sir," they replied in unison. "Begin." Margaret exploded off the starting line with controlled aggression. The first obstacle was the low crawl, and she dropped to her belly, moving through the mud beneath the barbed wire with the fluid technique she'd practiced hundreds of times. Her form was perfect, body low, elbows and knees driving her forward efficiently. She emerged from the crawl in third place among her group, which was exactly where she wanted to be. Not pushing so hard that she'd burn out early, but not so conservative that she'd fall behind. The 5-foot barrier was next. Margaret hit it at speed, planted her hands on top, and vaulted over cleanly. Months of practice had turned this obstacle into one of her strengths. She landed running and headed for her former nemesis, the 8-foot wall. This was the obstacle that had broken her confidence in the early days of training. Now, as she approached it, Margaret felt only determination. She hit the wall with perfect technique: running start, plant the left foot high, explosive jump, grab the top edge with both hands, pull up while swinging the right leg over. For a moment, hanging from the top of the wall, Margaret flashed back to that first disastrous practice run when she'd needed help from 3 other recruits to make it over. Now she was pulling herself up and over with smooth efficiency. She landed on the other side and immediately looked for Martinez, her unofficial training partner. He was slightly ahead of her, having made quick work of the wall with his natural athleticism. Thompson was right beside her, both of them in good position. The rope climb loomed ahead. 20 feet of vertical challenge that had to be completed quickly to maintain overall time. Margaret grabbed the rope with confidence, using the technique she and Williams had refined over dozens of practice sessions. Instead of trying to muscle her way up, she used her legs to support her weight, moving hand over hand with rhythm and control. Halfway up, she allowed herself a quick glance at her progress relative to the others. Martinez was ahead, as expected, but she was keeping pace with Thompson, and even gaining slightly on Foster, who had been struggling with the rope. At the top, Margaret rang the bell with authority and began her controlled descent. No rushing here. A fall would cost far more time than a careful climb down. She hit the ground and immediately moved toward the tire course. The tire course was about agility and rhythm rather than raw strength. Margaret danced through the tires with quick, precise steps, her feet finding the centers of each tire automatically. This was where her smaller size became an advantage. She could move through the tires faster than some of the larger recruits. Coming out of the tires, Margaret realized with surprise that she was now in second place within her group, trailing only Martinez. Thompson had lost time on the rope climb, and the others had fallen further behind. The balance beam required focus and confidence. Margaret had fallen off this obstacle numerous times during training, but now she moved across it with steady purpose. Don't look down, trust your balance, maintain forward momentum. She reached the end without a wobble. The second low crawl was shorter but muddier than the first. Margaret dropped and moved through quickly, her technique now automatic, up and running toward the rope swing, the final obstacle. The rope swing over the mud pit had been added to the course specifically to test courage as much as technique. Recruits had to grab a rope, swing across a 12-foot mud pit, and land on a narrow platform on the other side. Falling meant crawling out of the pit and trying again, which would cost precious minutes. Margaret grabbed the rope and backed up to get maximum momentum. This was no time for hesitation. She ran forward and launched herself into the swing with complete commitment. For a moment she was flying through the air, the rope burning in her hands, the mud pit passing beneath her. She landed hard but clean on the platform and released the rope immediately, 50 yards to the finish line. Margaret sprinted with everything she had left, her lungs burning and her legs pumping. She could see Sergeant Williams at the finish line, stopwatch in hand. "Come on, Hayes, bring it home." Margaret crossed the finish line and immediately bent over, hands on her knees, fighting to catch her breath. She'd given everything she had to the course, and now all she could do was wait for the time. Martinez had finished about 10 seconds ahead of her, and Thompson crossed the line a few seconds behind. The other 3 members of their group were still working their way through the course. "Time!" Williams called out as the last member of their group finished. Margaret straightened up, her heart still pounding. What was it? Williams looked at her stopwatch, then at Margaret, and for a moment her professional composure slipped into something approaching amazement. 13 minutes, 42 seconds. Margaret stared at her in disbelief. "What did you say? 13:42? Hayes, you just beat the required time by more than a minute." The news hit Margaret like a physical blow. Not only had she passed, she had dominated the course. The time wasn't just good enough, it was actually competitive with some of the best performers in the company. Martinez grabbed her in a bear hug, lifting her off the ground. "You did it. You actually did it." Other recruits who had been watching rushed over to congratulate her. Even some who had been skeptical were now offering genuine praise. The transformation from liability to success story was complete. But the real validation came from Captain Rivera, who approached as the crowd of well-wishers dispersed. "Outstanding performance, Hayes," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen thousands of recruits attempt this course. "That was one of the most impressive runs I've seen in my 3 years commanding this company." "Thank you, sir. I mean it. When you first arrived here, I'll be honest, I had my doubts. But you've just proven something important about the nature of military service." Margaret waited for him to continue. "People think this job is about being young and strong and fearless. But the best soldiers I've served with weren't necessarily the strongest or the fastest. They were the ones who refused to quit, who found ways to overcome their limitations, and who earned the respect of their peers through determination and character." Rivera paused, studying Margaret with new respect. "You've done all of that and more. You should be proud." As the captain walked away, Margaret felt a wave of emotion that surprised her with its intensity. 3 months earlier, she had been a forgotten widow, wondering if her life had any purpose left. Now she was a soldier who had not only survived basic training, but excelled at its most challenging test. Amy's group was called Next, and Margaret found herself in the strange position of offering encouragement and advice to her young friend. The role reversal was striking. The person everyone had expected to fail was now coaching others towards success. "Just stay calm and trust your technique," Margaret told Amy as her group prepared. "You've done this course dozens of times. It's all muscle memory now." Amy nodded nervously. "I can't believe you beat 1342. That's insane." "You can do even better," Margaret replied with confidence. "You're faster and stronger than me. Just don't let the pressure get to you." Amy's run was solid if unspectacular. She finished in 14 minutes and 8 seconds, a comfortable pass that ensured she would graduate with the rest of the platoon. When she crossed the finish line, she immediately ran to Margaret for celebration. "We did it!" Amy screamed. "We both did it." As the remaining groups completed their runs, Margaret found herself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. The physical transformation was obvious. She was stronger, faster, and more capable than she had been in 20 years. But the mental and emotional changes were even more profound. She had rediscovered parts of herself that she'd forgotten existed. The determination that had carried her through college and teaching career, the resilience that had helped her survive David's death, the quiet strength that had allowed her to raise 2 successful children. All of these qualities had been awakened and amplified by the challenges of military training. More importantly, she had learned that age was far less limiting than she'd believed. Yes, she would never be 18 again, but that didn't mean she was powerless or useless. Experience, wisdom, and determination could overcome many physical limitations. The final group completed their runs, and Sergeant Williams gathered the successful recruits for closing remarks. Of the 48 people who had started the day, 42 had passed. Margaret was not only among the successes, she was one of the top performers. "You've all accomplished something significant today," Williams told the group. "You've proven that you have what it takes to be soldiers. But remember, this is just the beginning. Graduation is next week, and then your real service begins." Margaret nodded along with the others, but part of her was already thinking beyond graduation. She had originally joined the military for financial security and to prove she wasn't finished. Now she was beginning to understand that she might have found something even more valuable, a new sense of purpose and capability that would serve her for years to come. As the group dispersed, Margaret walked slowly back toward the barracks, savoring the moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and the final preparations for graduation. But today belonged to her. She had done the impossible. She had proven every doubter wrong. Most importantly, she had proven to herself that Margaret Hayes was far from finished. In fact, at 42 years old, she was just getting started. The week following the obstacle course test passed in a blur of final preparations. administrative tasks, and a gradual shift in atmosphere as basic training drew to a close. The intensity that had defined the past 3 months began to ease, replaced by a sense of accomplishment and anticipation for what lay ahead. Margaret found herself in an unexpected position within the platoon hierarchy. Her spectacular performance on the obstacle course had earned her a level of respect that she'd never imagined possible. Recruits who had barely acknowledged her existence now sought her advice on everything from military procedures to life decisions. "It's weird," Amy observed one evening as they prepared their dress uniforms for graduation. "Remember when people called you the weak link? Now everyone wants to be like you." Margaret smiled as she pressed a crease into her uniform pants. "I think they just realized that there are different ways to be strong." The transformation wasn't limited to how others saw her. Margaret's own self-perception had undergone a fundamental shift. The woman who had arrived at Fort Moore 3 months earlier, uncertain and overwhelmed, had been replaced by someone who understood her own capabilities and wasn't afraid to test them. This new confidence manifested itself in unexpected ways. When Captain Rivera asked for volunteers to speak at the graduation ceremony about overcoming challenges in basic training, Margaret surprised herself by raising her hand. Rivera studied her thoughtfully. "You're sure? You'll be speaking in front of the entire battalion, plus family members. That's several hundred people." "I'm sure, sir." After 20 years of teaching high school students, speaking to a crowd didn't intimidate Margaret. If anything, she felt she had something important to say about persistence, determination, and the danger of underestimating people based on superficial characteristics. The news that Hayes would be one of the graduation speakers spread quickly through the company. Most reactions were positive. Margaret had become genuinely popular among her fellow recruits, but there were still a few holdouts. "I can't believe they're having her speak," Coleman complained during evening chow. "What's her big accomplishment? Barely passing basic training at 42? Martinez, who had become one of Margaret's strongest defenders, confronted him immediately. "Barely passing?" She had the 3rd best time on the obstacle course in the entire company. "And she did it starting from way behind everyone else." "That's not the point," Coleman insisted. "The whole thing is a publicity stunt. Look at the inspirational old lady who made it through basic training. It's not real military stuff." The comment stung, but Margaret had learned to deal with Coleman's negativity. More importantly, she had learned to distinguish between valid criticism and jealousy-driven hostility. "He's wrong, you know," said Private Kim, a quiet recruit from California, who rarely spoke up about anything. "What you did here was real military stuff. The most military stuff, actually." "How do you figure?" Margaret asked. "The military is supposed to be about accomplishing impossible missions, taking on challenges that seem too big and finding a way to succeed anyway." "That's exactly what you did." Kim's observation resonated with Margaret as she worked on her graduation speech that evening. She'd initially planned to focus on the importance of perseverance and hard work, but she began to see her experience in broader terms. Basic training hadn't just been about proving she could keep up with people half her age. It had been about demonstrating that the military's core values, duty, honor, courage, and commitment, weren't limited by age, gender, or background. They were universal principles that could be embodied by anyone willing to embrace them. The speech began to take shape around this theme. Margaret wanted to challenge the audience to think beyond their preconceptions about who could serve and what military excellence looked like. 2 days before graduation, families began arriving at Fort Moore for the ceremony. Margaret's children, Sarah and Michael, drove down from Ohio together, along with her sister, Janet. The reunion was emotional. None of them had seen Margaret since she'd enlisted, and the physical transformation was dramatic. "Mom, you look incredible," Sarah said, studying her mother's lean, muscled frame and confident posture. "I mean, you always looked good, but this is different. You look like a warrior." Janet was more direct. "I owe you an apology, Maggie. I thought you'd lost your mind when you enlisted." "I was wrong." "You weren't wrong to be concerned," Margaret replied. "I wasn't sure I could do it either." "But you did it anyway," Michael said with pride. "That's the most impressive part." The family spent the evening catching up and touring the base. Margaret showed them the training facilities where she'd struggled and eventually succeeded, including the infamous obstacle course that had nearly ended her military career before it began. "This is where you broke the record?" Sarah asked, staring at the 8-foot wall that had once seemed insurmountable to her mother. "I didn't break any records," Margaret laughed. I just did well enough to pass. Mom, Michael said seriously, you realize you're going to inspire a lot of people with your story. People who think they're too old or not strong enough to pursue their dreams? Margaret considered the comment. She'd been so focused on her own journey that she hadn't thought much about its broader implications. But Michael was right. Her success would inevitably be seen as proof that age and conventional limitations could be overcome with sufficient determination. I hope so, she said quietly. But I also hope people understand that this wasn't easy. I almost quit a dozen times. This isn't about anyone being able to do anything they want. It's about being willing to work harder than you ever thought possible for something you really care about. The night before graduation, the successful recruits gathered for a final formation and closing remarks from their drill sergeants. The atmosphere was celebratory but also nostalgic. These people had shared an intense experience that would bond them for life. Sergeant Williams addressed the platoon with uncharacteristic emotion. 3 months ago, you were civilians. Tomorrow, you'll be soldiers. What happened in between changed all of you, but some transformations were more dramatic than others. Her eyes found Margaret in the formation. Hayes, front and center. Margaret stepped forward, uncertain what was happening. When you arrived here, Williams continued, I honestly didn't think you'd make it through the first week. You were older, slower, and weaker than everyone else. You struggled with every physical challenge we threw at you. Margaret felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, even though she knew Williams was building toward something positive. But you taught all of us something important about what it means to be a soldier. You showed us that heart matters more than muscle. That determination can overcome almost any limitation. And that the strongest person in the room isn't always the one who looks the part. Williams paused, and Margaret realized that several of her fellow recruits were nodding in agreement. Your obstacle course time of 13 minutes and 42 seconds wasn't just a personal victory. It was one of the best times posted by anyone in this company in the past year, but more importantly, the way you achieved that time, through smart training, technical improvement, and sheer force of will, exemplifies everything we try to teach here. The drill sergeant's voice grew stronger. Hayes, you didn't just graduate basic training, you dominated it. And you did it in a way that makes all of us better soldiers. The platoon erupted in applause. Margaret stood at attention, fighting back tears as her fellow recruits showed their appreciation for her journey. Later that evening, as she polished her dress uniform one final time, Margaret reflected on William's words. She had come to basic training hoping to prove she wasn't too old to start over. Instead, she had discovered that her age and experience were actually advantages that she'd never properly valued. Graduation day dawned clear and warm. The ceremony was held on the main parade field, with hundreds of family members gathered in bleachers to watch their loved ones officially become soldiers. Margaret's speech was scheduled for the middle of the program, after the formal presentation of awards but before the final oath. As she waited for her turn at the podium, she felt surprisingly calm. This was familiar territory. She'd been speaking to audiences for 20 years as a teacher. When Captain Rivera introduced her, the audience applauded politely. But Margaret sensed that many were curious about the unusual choice of speaker. A 42-year-old woman wasn't the typical face of military success. 3 months ago, Margaret began, a recruiter looked at my application and suggested I might be better suited for administrative work. He wasn't being mean, he was being realistic. I was older than most people who enlist, and I had no military background or athletic experience. She paused, scanning the audience of families and fellow soldiers. He wasn't wrong about my limitations. I was the slowest runner in my platoon. I struggled with every physical challenge. I needed help to get over walls and ropes that other recruits navigated easily. For most of basic training, I was exactly what you'd expect from a 42-year-old woman trying to be a soldier. Margaret could see puzzled expressions in the audience. Where was she going with this? But something funny happened along the way. I discovered that being a soldier isn't just about being young and strong and fast. It's about being reliable when others are depending on you. It's about finding solutions when problems seem impossible. It's about refusing to quit when everything tells you to quit. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. Those are qualities that can be developed at any age. In fact, those are qualities that sometimes come easier to people who have already faced life's challenges. People who have raised children, survived loss, overcome setbacks, and learned that persistence usually beats talent in the long run. Margaret could see nodding heads in the family section, parents and spouses who understood exactly what she was talking about. Last week, I completed the obstacle course that nearly broke me during training. I didn't just pass it. I posted one of the best times in the company. And I want to be clear about what that represents. She looked directly at her fellow graduates in the front rows. It represents 3 months of getting up every day and choosing to try again, even when yesterday's attempt failed. It represents learning from people half my age instead of being too proud to accept help. It represents discovering that your limitations are real, but they're also negotiable if you're willing to work hard enough and smart enough to overcome them. The audience was completely focused now, hanging on every word. The military taught me that age is just one factor in determining what you're capable of achieving. Experience, wisdom, and determination matter just as much, maybe more. Margaret concluded with a direct challenge to anyone listening who might be holding themselves back because of their age or perceived limitations. If you've ever told yourself you're too old to start over, too set in your ways to learn something new, or too far past your prime to take on a challenge, I want you to reconsider. 3 months ago, I was a grieving widow wondering if my best years were behind me. Today, I'm a United States soldier with a bright future ahead of me. She straightened to attention as the audience erupted in sustained applause. Don't let anyone tell you you're too old to chase your dreams, including yourself. The response to Margaret's speech was overwhelming. Family members approached her after the ceremony to share their own stories of dreams deferred because of age or circumstance. Several parents told her that her words had inspired them to reconsider their own assumptions about what was possible in their 40s, 50s, and beyond. But the most meaningful response came from her fellow graduates. Even Coleman, who had been her biggest skeptic, approached her with grudging respect. "I was wrong about you, Hayes," he said simply. "You earned your place here." Margaret accepted the apology gracefully. "We all earned our place here, Coleman. That's what makes us soldiers." As the day wound down and families prepared to leave, Margaret found herself looking ahead to her next assignment. She'd been selected for military intelligence training, a field that valued analytical thinking and attention to detail over raw physical ability. "Are you nervous about what comes next?" Amy asked as they said their goodbyes. Margaret considered the question. 3 months earlier, the answer would have been an emphatic yes. Now, she felt nothing but excitement about the challenges ahead. "I'm ready," she said with conviction. "Whatever comes next, I'm ready for it." As her children and sister prepared for the drive back to Ohio, Margaret stood on the steps of the barracks where she'd spent the most challenging and rewarding 3 months of her life. The scared, uncertain woman who had arrived at Fort Moore was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more confident, and more capable than she'd ever imagined possible. At 42 years old, Margaret Hayes had proved that it's never too late to discover what you're really made of. Her journey from too old to teach to record-breaking soldier was complete, but her story as a United States Army soldier was just beginning. She wasn't too old. She was exactly the right age to start the next chapter of her remarkable life.